Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the supplementary section of Module 1. And in this section, we want to review a few more terms and get into a bit of depth on a few topics that are beyond what would be a typical introduction. I do hope that many of you are interested in this deeper dive. The terms and the topics are really in no particular order, but I think it'll be very easy to relate them to the main bulk of the material that we have studied so far. So the first thing is to see how the scholars refined the concept of a adl narrator. If you remember the 5 conditions for a sahih hadith, the first one of those conditions is that each of the narrators should be a adl narrator. And we define the adl narrator vaguely as a righteous and upstanding person. And the hadith scholars, though, defined it a bit more precisely. And it's interesting to see how carefully they put their criteria and how hard they work to make sure that the narrators of the hadith were trustworthy. And these things were incorporated into the biographies of men, the biographies of the hadith transmitters, so that the scholars could judge each transmitter in terms of whether or not he was a adl narrator. So for a narrator to be considered adl, which again vaguely means righteous, upstanding, pious, religious, he must be upstanding in 2 different areas. The first is the deen, the religion. So the narrator needs to be a religious and practicing Muslim who is not known to commit major sins or to insist on and persist in minor sins. People who were known to do this could not be considered a adl narrator. The second area is more interesting. It is what is known in Arabic as al-muru'ah. Muru'ah. Muru'ah refers to manners, to the general character of the person. So let me give you a few examples. A person may be good in their religion in that they avoid the major harams and they do the major duties, but muru'ah means that their behavior should be considered good behavior. They should not be outrageous or vulgar. So for example, a man might dress in a way which technically covers his aura, his private parts, so he's not doing anything haram, but he may be somebody who wears a shirt that's, open to the navel and shows off all their chest and so on, and may be excessively revealing. The person may be crude in their speech or vulgar in their jokes or humor. Such a person would not be considered to fulfill the condition of muru'ah. And that is how careful the hadith scholars were, that they tried to collect all of these facts about the transmitters. Some of them, for example, said that somebody who was too much of a jokester and laughed too much and, was not a serious type person, would not be considered at the highest levels of trustworthiness. But if a person fulfills the deen and the muru'ah, then they are considered adl. Now we said that in addition to being righteous and upstanding, which are moral qualities, the narrator must also be a dhabit. That means that he must have precision. And this is a technical quality, not a moral quality, like having a good memory, for example. And the scholars divided being a dhabit into the realm of verbal precision or written precision. If he was transmitting the hadith verbally, then he must have a good verbal memory. And this was tested by comparing his rendition of some hadiths to those of other narrators. If the matn, and remember matn means the content of the hadith, is different, or if he mixes up the chains of transmission, then his memory is considered unreliable. And if he is transmitting the hadith in a written fashion, they would check on how carefully he kept his written materials. Was he scrupulous in making sure that they were not damaged and so forth. And the being a dhabit was considered just as important or maybe even more important than being a adl narrator, because if somebody could not precisely transmit hadiths, it really didn't matter if their character was good, they could not be relied upon. And there's an interesting incident that I put in the syllabus about Imam al-Bukhari when he arrived at a town, and he was hailed as this great hadith scholar, and the sheikhs there wanted to test him. And so they got 10 sheikhs, each of them with 10 hadiths, but they on purpose mixed up the chains of transmission of the hadiths, substituted one for another. And as you know, the anatomy of the hadith that we covered, a hadith has two parts: the isnad, the chain of transmission, and the matn, the content of the hadith, and they go together to make the hadith. So each of the 10 sheikhs started giving his 10 hadiths, and each hadith al-Bukhari heard, he said, I don't know that hadith. I don't know that hadith. I don't know that hadith, for all of the 100 hadiths. I'm sure the story is somewhat apocryphal, but it illustrates a point in any case. So after they were done, all of the spectators looking around were saying, this is the great scholar, he doesn't know any of the hadiths. And then after they were done, al-Bukhari then went back to each of the sheikhs and he said, the hadith you recited, the correct isnad is such and such, and here's the content. The correct isnad is such and such, and here's the content. And he gave all 100 hadiths with their correct isnads. As I said, I'm sure there's some exaggeration in the story, and God knows best, but this was the sort of level of precision and scholarship that the highest level scholars expected of themselves. Now, if someone was both a adl and a dhabit, upstanding in their deen and their muru'ah, and precise, then he was known by the hadith scholars as a thiqat. A thiqat is someone who can be trusted. And when they wrote in their books the biographies of men, you would say this person is a thiqat. That means he is someone who is fully trustworthy. Now, it's important to note that the grading of a thiqa or not is kind of simplistic, and the hadith scholars actually devised much more complex systems that they use to grade the transmitters. So again, we can keep going deeper and deeper in the supplementary material just to give you an acquaintance in case you read the hadith literature firsthand. So instead of the simplistic grading system of somebody is a thiqat or not a thiqat, the hadith scholars actually devised even more complex grading systems that they used to grade the transmitters. One scheme had 4 grades, another had 6 grades. So, for example, in the 6th grade system, the highest grade was Imam or Hafid, and so you'll hear people often talk about Imam al-Bukhari, because that's the highest grade, or Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar, that we will encounter shortly. The next grade was reliable, trustworthy. Grade 3 was they sometimes make mistakes. Grade 4 is they are a weak transmitter. Grade 5, they are abandoned, mahjur, you don't really accept from them unless there's very significant corroboration from elsewhere. And grade 6, they are a liar. They fabricate hadiths, and then that's it, you're done. You do not take their hadith under any circumstances. The great scholar Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who was known as Al-Hafidh Ibn Hajar, again referring to that highest grade, he actually devised an even more complex system that had 12 grades in descending order of strength and reliability. So grade 1 was the best, grade 12 was the worst. He wrote a major commentary on the book Sahih al-Bukhari. It is known as Fath al-Bari fi Sharh Sahih al-Bukhari. And his scheme of 12 grades was adopted by many later scholars. Now we get to see how these grades were actually put to use to kind of refine the concept of the grading of hadith that we covered in the main bulk of Module 1. But before we go there, I just want to note an interesting point for you that you should be aware of. And that in the books of Ilm al-Rijal, among Sunni jurists, the narrators that are subjected to this sort of grading go up only to the level of the successors, the tabi'un. The companions of the Prophet, for the purposes of hadith criticism, for the purposes of grading whether a hadith is sound or not, are considered to be all equally righteous and reliable as narrators. So they do not get scrutinized. You start the scrutiny from the next level down, the successors. And interestingly, the definition of a companion has varied among the scholars, but the generally accepted definition is, and I'm quoting here from Professor Jonathan Brown's Hadeeth, the book called Hadeeth, who in turn quotes al-Bukhari, and this is a widely accepted definition, quote, anyone who saw the Prophet even for a moment while a believer and then died as Muslim. So anybody who fulfills that criteria is considered a companion, and all of the companions are considered to be at the highest level of reliability because it is believed that they would not lie about the Prophet. What do you think of this assumption? I actually find this assumption highly questionable, to be very honest with you, because we know that there were hypocrites that were sometimes known to the Prophet, sometimes maybe not even known to him. Yet they would still be counted as companions. Somebody who saw the Prophet even for a moment and then died as a Muslim would be at the same level as Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. These are the same companions, some of whom participated in the killing of Uthman ibn Affan, the Khalifa of Islam. They are the same companions who participated in the sectarian battles of Muslims fighting Muslims, like in the Battle of Siffin between the forces of Ali ibn Abi Talib and Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, fought about 25 years after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And it is known that in the camp of Ali ibn Abi Talib, for example, there were approximately 70 companions who attended the Battle of Badr and so forth. And these were Muslims killing Muslims, fighting over the Khilafah and the power. And of course, each of them thought they were fighting for the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but nonetheless, they were Muslims killing each other. And so, and by the way, the Battle of Siffin, it's estimated that 60 to 70,000 Muslims were killed. So how one simply makes this assumption that all of the companions are of equal reliability because being with the Prophet even for a moment would have endowed them with this unrelenting sense of honesty, I think is an unreasonable assumption, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. But in any case, I wanted to make it clear to you that that is the assumption that the scholars work with, because most people are not aware of this. And that's why I've relegated these more controversial things to the supplementary material. By the way, how would the Hadith scholars have come up with such an assumption? Well, it's based, for example, on the first part of verse 110 of Surah Al-Imran, Surah 3, where the Quran says of the Muslims, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم كنتم خير أمة أخرجت للناس تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر. That you are the best nation produced as an example for mankind. You enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. And on to the rest of the verse, which I didn't recite fully. And so they were saying that this justifies such an assumption. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now, let's get to how grading systems like that of Ibn Hajar was used to grade the narrators. So recall that weak hadiths can be classified as da'if, which is weak, or mawdu', which is fabricated, and munkar, which is rejected. And none of these have authority in matters of law. Now, according to Ibn Hajar's grading, and remember, in Ibn Hajar's grading system, grade number 1 was the strongest possible narrator, grade 12 was the weakest. Any narrator of grade 6 or lower would cause weakness in the hadith. So if anybody in the chain of narration was of grade 6 or lower, that hadith automatically becomes weak. Now, the weakness, of course, could be of various degrees. If the hadith had a narrator of grade 12, the worst grade, it was classified as mawdu' or forged. If a narrator in the chain has a grade of 11, then it would be classified as batil, which is defective and rejected. If the narrator is of grade 10, it would be called a munkar, distrusted and rejected. If the narrator is of grade 6 to 8, then the hadith is simply da'if or weak. That means we don't have a strong enough evidence to reliably relate it to the Prophet. And when we come to the application of hadith, you will see that hadiths that are just simply weak, according to the opinion of some scholars, do have a role in Islamic jurisprudence. But hadiths that are batil, that are mawdu', that are munkar, those rejected hadiths, they have no role. And that's why this grading system becomes important. And some scholars even made another grade in there that was called da'if jiddan, very weak, which was between weak and between the other grades that are rejected. Now, just to again put things in perspective, these were grading systems to grade all of the narrators in the chain, assuming that the chain is continuous. So one cause of weakness of a hadith is that, yes, I do have a continuous chain, I have a complete isnad, because remember that was condition number 3, having a complete isnad, but the narrators are weak. Next, we will take up the issue of divisions of weak hadiths based not on the strength or weakness of the narrators, but on incompleteness or completeness in the chain of narration.